everyone in from the waiting room. Christine, shall we?
Please do start. Everyone's in. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this fantastic event. FWN Business is for Girls. It's one of our series of events that are called the Is for Girls series. And the idea is that we try and demystify some of those areas that are traditionally seen as male-dominated areas. My name's Catherine Fuchs, or I should say Councillor Catherine Fuchs. I was elected last Thursday for the first time, or Friday. Thank you, sisters. And really excited to be here today. I sit on the Fabian Women's Exec, and I'm chair of Fabian's Cymru, so I'm here from Wales, the only country in the UK with a Labour government in power. Very proud of that. So I'm really excited about this evening. We are going to have, I'm going to introduce each of our panel just before they speak, and they're each going to give us 5 minutes around the area of business and women in business from their own perspective. And then we will have a chance for questions. So do please either put questions in the chat, or given we're a nice small number, I will probably ask you to unmute if you've got a question later on, and you can ask your question to the panel yourselves, which would be really great. So I'm really delighted to welcome our first speaker, who's Naomi Pohl, and she is General Secretary of the Musicians Union, and she's the first woman to be elected in that position. And we're really looking forward to hearing from her around inequalities and barriers faced by self-employed women and musicians, I'm guessing. So over to you, Naomi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm recently elected General Secretary of the MU, and got to say, you know, women face some barriers even in employed jobs, and certainly running for election. It's not necessarily an even playing field, but you know, here I am, and I'm absolutely thrilled to bits, especially because the music industry is very male dominated, particularly in top positions, and the same goes for the trade union movement historically, although we're beginning to see more and more women in leadership positions in the union movement, which is absolutely fantastic. But I think that the situation is worse for self-employed musicians. Generally, we've got a bit of a crisis for our freelance musicians, because they've had, during the pandemic, 2 years, 3 years without any work whatsoever, without any income. It's been really tough. A lot of our members have had to go and get alternative jobs, doing sort of delivery driver jobs or working in the care industry, trying to make ends meet when they haven't been able to play music. And it brings up a lot of challenges, because the way that musicians tend to keep their hand in is by playing and working and performing and rehearsing and collaborating, and they've not been able to do very much of that at all. So I think a lot of freelance musicians are already suffering a crisis of confidence coming back to work, making sure their playing standard is what it was, and starting to go back into really large groups and ensembles. And I think that the situation is particularly tough for women. So self-employed women obviously don't have the employment rights. It's much harder for them to take on cases related to discrimination. A lot of them, the pay and conditions issue, a lot of our members work late at night, and they're fairly low paid. And often they have to do a lot of touring and a lot of travel and staying in hotels, and the pay, unfortunately, and expenses often don't cover staying in a decent hotel, which means sometimes they're staying places that are miles from the venue, and frankly not up to scratch. You know, they can be put in situations that are quite unsafe, and I've certainly heard lots of instances of that. They can't afford to get a taxi home because the fee doesn't cover it. So they're trying to travel home late at night, maybe lift sharing, maybe trying to get home on public transport late, or if public transport's not running, what do they do? It's really difficult. I think it's very hard for women, particularly freelancers working in those kind of conditions late at night. So safety is something I really want us to focus on. At the end of the day, the employers and the engagers of our members should be responsible for making sure that people can get to work safely and get home safely, and that they're not put unduly at risk. I think there's a lot of unconscious bias as well. So we are a male-dominated industry, and if all your music venues in the UK are run by men, that's not the case, but I would say the majority of those who run music venues and are booking are probably men. Then who are they booking? You know, there's been a lot of publicity around festival lineups being very heavily male-dominated, and you have to ask, who is it who's actually making the decisions to book those acts? And if it's men, there is unconscious bias at play there, certainly. We have even more of a problem with songwriters, because very few songwriters are female. And that's not because the talent's not there, but it's because, again, people tend to book the people that they've always worked with or collaborate with the people they've always worked with. And I think songwriters are about kind of 90% male. The same goes for producers and engineers. There's a lot of unconscious bias around women using technology for their work, and so things like composition obviously involve a lot of technology, and there's an assumption that women won't want to go into those roles or won't be qualified to do those roles, which is grim and obviously not at all the case. So we've got a lot of challenges, and as a union, we are trying to put best practice guidance in place. We've got a safe space service, which is there for women in particular to report instances of discrimination, bullying, sexual harassment, and we deal with those kind of issues on, unfortunately, a fairly regular basis. We've got new resources like a breastfeeding policy for freelancers to use in workplaces, and we promote that to employers and engagers. We know how positive it is for women to be part of the workforce, and how it changes the culture of organisations, and how it changes the work that's produced in a really positive way. So it's in the interest of employers and engagers to work with women, and we've got to break down these very, very male-dominated workplaces and make sure we get a better gender balance, because it's in everybody's best interest. We also have a very active women's network, which is something that we've recently set up in the union, and that's a real positive, because you're giving people safe spaces to talk about the issues that they have, to help us come up with policies and proposals that we can take forward as a union. And, you know, those people who've attended women's network meetings do end up populating our committees. So we've got much more balanced committees now, which is really important too. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of what it's like to be a self-employed musician. And it, you know, particularly as a woman, it's really tough out there. We held a session recently on imposter syndrome, and it was absolutely packed full of women. And we've got to not have imposter syndrome. I do it myself. I start emails with apologies on a very regular basis. And then I think, why am I apologising for this? No way would a male colleague start an email with apologies. And I've got to get over that myself. And I appreciate that a lot of our members, particularly self-employed people who are working independently, they don't have the same network that I have in an employment situation. It's really tough for them to get over that. But we're providing the events and the support and the encouragement and the resources to hopefully give women a foot up and make sure that they do get those key roles.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. That's so interesting what you've said. And I think what we will find this evening is a lot of the same themes are probably going to come up: safety, unconscious bias and confidence. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more from the rest of the panel. And just to say, of course, there was a Welsh songwriter for the Eurovision song, Amy Woods, who is a songwriter. And she wrote the song apparently for our Eurovision entry, which is exciting. But anyway, that's only one example. I'm sure there are far too many, as you say, far too many men songwriters and not enough women. Well, there are, but they're not coming forward. They're not getting success. So I'm really delighted now to introduce Councillor Kemi Akinola. She is Deputy Leader-elect of the London Borough of Wandsworth, which of course Labour won very recently. So congratulations on that. But she's also CEO of Enriched People's Kitchen, So over to you, Kemi, around the structural barriers that women who are Black or minority ethnic have faced when setting up their own business. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So you're absolutely right. A lot of what Naomi said, I was nodding and saying, absolutely, that's exactly how I feel. I mean, something you said just towards the end is the question I always ask myself whenever I doubt myself. I just think, would a white man ask himself, would he question himself, would he do this? And the answer is always yes. So my answer is always yes. So yeah, I set up a charity called charity social enterprise called Be Enriched, and I was actually given another business, a social enterprise called Brixton People's Kitchen. Both do very similar things. They work in food. One has a shop, community shop, and a cafe. And Be Enriched is more of a community meal. We also have this double-decker bus that we converted into a mobile greengrocer. It was one of those, would a man do this? Yes, okay, I'm gonna do it. So so we have this double-decker bus that drives around and it's got a cafe on the top. It's very amazing. It's called the London Food Bus. Look it up. I don't recommend anybody else does it because it's the most expensive thing I've ever done in my life. And taking it to the garage, it's just months in the garage and it's thousands and thousands of pounds. Do something smaller. That's my little mini advice. But I mean, I think I would not have been able to actually set up or found Be Enriched if it wasn't actually that I'd had an accident at the time, because I had lots of free time. I was at home. I didn't have to go to work. I was getting, statutory sick pay at the time and, twiddling my thumbs, so to speak. And that's when I set up Be Enriched. And I think that is really important because I think a lot of the barriers to women being in business is A, not having the time, B, not having the money, we have so many other pressures on our lives that thinking about setting up a business is probably not the first thing on your mind. You want to ensure that you can eat, feed your family. I don't have any children either, so I think that was another very key factor in me being able to have that time and that money to set up a business. I think that when I did set up my business, lots of things went wrong. I did loads of things wrong and then did them right. They say fail until you succeed. I did a lot of failures, but here we are today. And I did manage also to get hold of a mentor, but I never actually found one that looked like me. So I think there's a lack of visually representative Black and other ethnicities, women, particularly in business, but I think also men, but particularly women in business. So I did have a couple of female mentors. They were amazing. And I think that's one of the things that I've always tried to be as a good role model for other women of color. But what I have found is that a lot of women are quite threatened by me, because more often than not, they may be the only Black woman, brown woman in the room and in the arena. And that has an advantage and a disadvantage. And the advantages, I guess, the advantage is that if you're the only brown person in the room, everyone feels that they have to listen to you, which is good. It's very, very good. But the disadvantage is that nobody will you haven't got anyone to back you up. And so your whatever your priorities are never seen as important. So I found that the women, when I did find other brown and Black women in the room, they had the attitude of, they've climbed the ladder and now they were pulling that ladder up behind them and they didn't want to support me or help me or work with me at all, which is not my attitude. And I don't think that's, how we generate a more democratic and fair sort of environment, especially in business. So one of the things that I do as part of my charity and my social enterprise is to mentor all women of all colors, but specifically women of color. Yeah, so I think that, so why else aren't there lots of Black women in business? And I think that there's also not a lot of support for Black and brown women in business. There's no career accelerators that just focus specifically on these type of women. However, I have found, I'm very quick, by the way, so I'm almost finished, don't worry. And I would say that anyone that is interested in getting into business or learning about business should check out Unlimited, because they have a real focus on people of colour, getting them into business and providing them with grants, support and mentors. And I think that's really important. And if anybody is also just wants to have a chat with me, they're welcome to get in contact with me, although I have got this new role now, deputy leader of a borough, so I am quite busy, but I will get back to you, I promise. Thank you.
That was great, Kemi. Thank you so much. I think, yeah, mentors are so important, and I know the Fabian Women's Network really works hard to provide mentors, and you raise a really important point there about more role models in business, and I'm hoping that some of the other participants might pick up on that, and there'll be questions definitely for you after, I'm sure, Kemi. So next on our list of brilliant speakers is we have Liz Hind, and Liz is a member of the Fabian Women's Network Executive Committee, and she is also a pub landlady and a member of Labour Business. So over to you, Liz, to share your experiences. Thank you.
I ought to say that I was a pub landlady. Unfortunately, I had to stop being a pub landlady a month ago now because of problems with business representation, which I will take you through. I've got a few slides, mainly to keep myself on track than anyone else. So hopefully, let's see if I can share. Can we all see that? Great. So I'm here to talk about the sort of small business angle and women in small business, and picking up exactly on things that Naomi was saying and Kemi was just saying. We have a massive problem with representation within who is allowed to talk about business and who gets taken seriously when they talk about business. I mean, here's a Google search of successful business people. They're overwhelmingly male, they're overwhelmingly white, but importantly, if you're thinking about small business, they're all people in suits that are worried about charts, that are worried about the value of their investment, rather than my sort of business, which looks far more like this, which is actually working people who have far more in common with Naomi's self-employed members than they do with those men in suits sitting in boardrooms, because this is work. And when we talk about everyday economy, this is what I think about, because these are all businesses we use every day to have our hair cut, to buy a card, a pint of milk, get our car fixed, and of course, to go to the pub and have a nice pint. This is, of course, the majority of business within the UK. So you can see here, the figures for businesses within the UK. They are overwhelmingly micro businesses that are employing 0 to 9 people, both in terms of number of businesses and local units. And unfortunately, I think it's this sort of group of business that struggles to have an independent voice for itself, and it struggles to get sort of fair representation. And I'm going to illustrate that by an example that I know extremely well, because this is the reason why I am not in business anymore. And it's a set of regulations called the Pubs Code. And it's one that I researched recently and published a paper on with York Law School. So if you want more information, there you go, look me up in Legal Studies Journal on this. This was research that we did through analysing arbitrations through this set of regulations called the Pubs Code, and I also interviewed pub tenants that had been through this process. Because you're not all pub tenants and don't quite understand how the pubs trade work, I will take you through it very quickly. It's a set of legislation that's there to give tenants an ability to access a legal arbitration process to get a fair rent. If you are a pub tenant, your rent is paid in 2 parts. It's paid through what's known as the dry rent, which is a fixed rent that you will pay weekly. And then on top of that, most tenants are subject to what's known as a beer tie, where they will only be able to buy a beer through the business that they rent that pub building through. So that's known as a wet rent, and you will have to buy that beer, wine, spirit, all of your products at a increased price. Now, that's a monopoly, so it has to be regulated in some way. So we analysed people that have gone through this process to get what's known as a market rent only. So they would only pay the dry rent, and they are then free to go and buy their beer or wine or whatever wherever they want it to. And you know, it's meant to protect tenants, but unfortunately there is a huge power imbalance in that system. So I interviewed tenants that had turned up to an arbitration process. They were on themselves, faced by a team of professional lawyers, by a well-regulated pub company. There were problems with timescales. So going through an arbitration process can take 2 years. So that's obviously 2 years where you're trying to run a business, you're trying to pour pints on Friday night, and then Monday morning go into an arbitration process. And obviously that's extremely stressful, expensive process. And because of that power imbalance, people aren't able to get that fair rent that they were looking for. And this became acute in COVID. So I've spoken to a lot of those tenants that have got market rent only deals, and they were told, no, you can't have any concessions at all during lockdown. So you're not allowed to open up your business, but the pub companies were discriminating against particular types of tenants and saying, no, you can't have any rent concessions at all. And then they were told, pay the debt. And if you can't pay the debt, which in some cases was hundreds of thousands of pounds, they were told, well, you can go back on the tie again. So without that representation, without our independent voice, which we struggled to get, that power imbalance became acute in a process which I can only describe as fire and rehire. So yeah, well, I am not talking to you from a pub anymore. I'm actually in temporary accommodation in a garage, literally a garage in Walthamstow, because in my own case, I wasn't looking for a market rent only, but I got to the end of my tenancy and I was told, no, we're upping the beer tie. My rent would have gone up by 150%. Now that's fire and rehire, but because it's seen as a business deal and a business situation, we see it in that lens. We don't see it as workers' rights. The other problem that we get is, because I'm not a person in a suit, I'm a working person, I've been told to my face, oh, well, you don't understand about business. You just run a pub, don't you? So as well as being a woman, we also can face other types of discrimination when we're trying to talk about our own rights at work. For women, of course, the situation is a lot worse. Only about 1 in 3 entrepreneurs are women. And I've just put some dates there to remind you of why that situation, I think, has happened, is because women's financial independence is something that is relatively new. So it's not until the 1970s that women were allowed to be members of the London Stock Exchange. It wasn't until 1975 we were allowed to independently have bank accounts. We had to wait to 1980 to get credit independently without a man's say so. And it wasn't until 1990 that we got independence for women to get tax returns. So we know as women's organisations that the route to equality goes at a snail's pace. And we've seen that in politics, and we've seen that to get that equality that we need, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes women's organisations to make a noise and to demand better. And with women's financial independence, we are starting very late on this. And what does that mean for the financing of women's small businesses? Well, women are less likely to apply for credit to start a business than men. But I don't think that we can blame those women, because the women that do apply for credit are less likely to be granted a business loan than a man. They can have exactly the same business plan, but if it's got a woman's name at the top, it's less likely to get that funding than a man, which makes absolutely no economic sense whatsoever, because of course, if you give women business loans, those women that do get credit outperform men. So it's not just a case where we need to do something about this because of equality issues. You know, we know that the economy is struggling at the moment. Unless we can fix this sort of sexism, we are holding back people who will be outperforming. And it's not just in credit that this is a problem. It's worse if we look at other forms of financing for business. If you look at venture capital, only 2% of venture capital funding goes to women. And again, that venture capital that does go to women, that capital outperforms. So you will get higher returns if you put your venture capital into women's businesses than other forms of business. So anyone here who has got some venture capital funding, get it into women's business quickly, because you're going to get a far higher return. Are we surprised about this? Well, no, not really, because, you know, as Naomi was talking about with the sexism within the music industry, we've got the same problem within the financial industry, because 92% of venture capital firms are run by men. Yeah, it makes absolutely no economic sense. It makes no sense from equality standpoint, none whatsoever. So what do we need to do about this? Well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. First of all, I'd really like us if we could reframe conversations about working rights. So we're not talking about the rights of workers, but instead we're looking at universal rights at work. So the right to be paid on time is a real problem if you're running a small business. Late payments is a real problem. We also need to look at all of those barriers which stop women engaging in employment, and think about those barriers in terms of how we support all working women, not just those that are on employment contracts. So, for example, I was delegate to Women's Conference, and I was there as the delegate from Labour Business. When it came to the priorities ballot at the end, and I had to pick one motion to go through to main conference, there was one motion in it that had anything to do with the sorts of women that I'm representing, and that was the motion on pregnancy loss, which came from the Musicians Union. So thank you for that, Naomi. You gave me something to vote for, and that's what I voted for. But we need to pick up our game, and we need to think about all working women, not just those women that are in employment. We desperately need to have business engagement that is accountable to everyone working in business. We've seen just how much funding and money there is in business lobbying through things like the Greensill scandal. Now, if you think about that sort of amount of money that is going around, do you think that your local pub landlady can afford to stump up that sort of money to be heard and to be represented? Well, of course we can't. And collective representation and the sorts of trade union models that we're used to talking about, you are going to struggle to have that sort of collective action when you're talking about so many small businesses. So for me, the answer to it is to make sure that we're looking at accountability in the trade organisations and the sorts of people that get to talk about business and sit on panels.
So sorry to interrupt, but you timed. If you can just wind up, that would be okay. The last 30 seconds. Thank you.
Competition, and of course we need feminism, women groups to start taking this seriously. It wasn't until women started taking gender pay gap seriously and demanding data that we saw action on that and improvements on that. The same needs to happen with women's business and women's finance for business. We need to demand that action. We don't understand the situation. There isn't even any funding available at the moment to do any research on this. So it's up to us as activists to demand that. And finally, because Anneliese is on that panel, we need to ask the question of where is that policy making space that all working women who aren't employed, that we can get together and we can start thrashing that out to have those sorts of general policies. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was fascinating. And I think it was really good to hear a different perspective, that one, your own experience from being a pub landlady and how that worked running that business for you. And I think many of us won't have ever heard about that situation. And that, well, we all know that there are power imbalances, unfortunately, in every sector of society for us. But yeah, in the pub sector, that sounds particularly acute. So thank you for that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel Burgin. She is going to talk about governance considerations, as she is a member of Labour Business, but also she's a company secretary. So over to you, Rachel. And I think Liz is sharing her screen again.
Thank you, Catherine. And just to say that this panel event has been, Liz and I have been working on it together, and very much we come from opposite ends of the business experience, particularly during lockdown. I work as a company secretary in finance in the asset management business in the City of London. And so I work at the sharp end of our corporate world. And what I've tried to do with this presentation is enter into the spirit of this Baby and Women's Network series in terms of demystifying aspects of policy that we may not be familiar with. Now, I'm a company secretary. What is a company secretary? The role of a company secretary is to advise boards of directors on matters of corporate governance. What is corporate governance? Over the page. It is not the day-to-day management of the company. It is what the board of directors does to hold management to account. And it's important to understand the difference between the board of directors and executive management. And if you think about it, the responsibility of executive management is to execute the strategy of the company, and the directors are supposed to hold the executive management to account for doing that effectively. And at the board level, it is their job to set the values and culture of the company. And it's also independent, non-executive directors play a hugely important role in corporate governance, because they don't work for the company. They're brought in from outside, and their job is to provide independent challenge to management that is independent of any interest they may have in the company as employees, which is what executive director's position is in. And it also facilitates the effective entrepreneurial and prudent management that can deliver the long-term success of the company. And that is taken from the UK Corporate Governance Code. Now, why do we need corporate governance? Because lots of things have gone very wrong on lots of occasions. So I'm going to give you some scandals which you will likely be familiar with, which will give you a flavour of why we need effective corporate governance. Next slide. Some of you might be aware of the Robert Maxwell scandal, and he was a very big figure, media mogul back in the day, who owned Maxwell Communication Corporation and the Mirror Group. And he was both the chair of the board and the chief executive officer, which meant that he was only accountable to himself. And there needs to be a separation between the role of chair and the role of CEO. And this was a very good example of why, because following his suicide, a massive hole in the pensions fund was found. And so what's the problem here? There was a total lack of accountability in his business dealings, and it illustrates the importance of non-executive directors serving on boards and holding executive management to account. You can't have executive management holding themselves to account, which was what was happening there. Next one. Enron scandal. This is such a huge scandal that it turns up in every company secretary exam, because everything went wrong. But this was a scandal some decades ago where staff were cooking the books on a systemic scale. Staff were incentivized to do so, and the company culture encouraged it. The auditors, Arthur Anderson, they don't exist anymore because of this scandal, were complicit. And what were the failures here? the board failed to hold management to account. There was a lack of audit independence, and the fish rots from the head. In this particular case, the board of directors were shaping a culture where corruption was encouraged. So next one. This is where we get onto actually the issue of boardroom diversity. Financial crisis, 2007, 2008. There was a lot of investigations afterwards for why that happened. And one of the theories following various government reports was that there was groupthink on company boards. So boards were making risky financial decisions. And what wasn't happening is that the board of directors were going, hang on a minute, why are you doing that? And asking the kind of awkward questions that hold executive management to account for their decisions and for their risky behaviour. And one of the theories that came out of this, there's been various reports, including a Parker review, said that one of the reasons for that was basically if you have a group of 5 white men, 10 white men who all went to public school and they all approach the world in exactly the same way, they will approach problems in the same way, and actually what you need is a little bit of fly in the ointment where people say, well actually I'm coming at this from a different direction, why on earth are you doing this? And one of the things that came out of that was that, I mean, I draft minutes, I draft board minutes, my minutes get read not only by the auditors but also by the Financial Conduct Authority, and they read that in order to check that the directors are asking awkward questions. And I have to minute the awkward questions that they ask. And this all comes out of this. And, you know, even the regulation of board minute writing has come out of the financial crisis. Next slide. I love that I managed to find boardroom diversity and Harriet Harman. The policy driver for increased boardroom diversity is not Labour values. It's commercial considerations, because boards that are diverse are demonstrably more profitable. And this is because they make better decisions and because there is less groupthink, because people ask awkward questions. Now, according to UK Corporate Governance Code, which governs FTSE 350 companies that are listed on the stock exchange, boards are required to consider, when appointing directors, to give consideration to diversity of gender, social background, ethnic background, cognitive diversity and personal strengths. There are no penalties for boards not being diverse. The regime of the UK Corporate Governance Code is what's known as comply or explain, which means you either do what the UK Corporate Governance Code says or you explain in your annual report why you haven't done it. But like, there are FTSE 350 companies that have all male boards and nobody's going after them, you know. It's all accountability in a very civil and not a criminal way. And I just want to kind of throw this in. The issue of boardroom diversity is about diversity of perspectives, and I think it raises interesting questions about the Labour Party's own governance, specifically in terms of factional diversity and in terms of how we govern ourselves to ensure we are not subject to groupthink. So just very quickly, because I know we're short of time, you know, what kind of policy issues can we think about raising? Section 172 of the Companies Act requires that directors promote the success of the company. Now, there's been a lot of work in Labour circles, Labour business has done work on this, how we redraft this particular section to, instead of it being weighted towards the interests of shareholders, to be actually the duty to promote the success of the company is more wider in terms of the public good. And there are ways in which we might think about redrafting that would make it more that way rather than just the shareholder interest. Next slide. I just wanted to very quickly draw your attention to some things that are going through Parliament at the moment. The next slide is on Economic Crime and Transparency Bill. And this is particularly relevant to what's going on in Russia, because you have corporate structures which kind of try to hide assets, and we need to kind of make sure that there is transparency to make sure companies aren't able to do that. Next slide is on audit reform. This is something, audit reform bill, it is in the Queen's speech as well. So that, at the moment we have the big four accountancy firms who want a broader range of companies competing for audit work. And then finally, modern slavery bill. You might have seen this, you're enrolled in the co-op party. This is where companies need to demonstrate that they have undertaken due diligence, that they do not have, there is not modern slavery in their supply chain, and companies over a certain threshold are required to sign a modern slavery statement every year to confirm that they have done that. Obviously there is work that could be done on making that more robust. That's all I've got. That's a massive whistle-stop tour of corporate governance, but hopefully it's given us something to chew on.
That was brilliant, Rachel. You've cantered through that really fast, but given us a really fantastic overview of corporate governance and some good examples there of how not to do it. Really good. I'm delighted now to hand over to Anneliese Dodds, MP. She is Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities and Chair of the Labour Party. And we're really delighted to have her here today. I think she's going to give a bit of a response to what she's heard, but also talk about your priorities for women in business and what they would be. Thank you, Anneliese. Over to you.
Great, well, thank you very much indeed, Catherine, or rather Councillor Fuchs, as I will now call you, and I'm very, very proud to do so. And it's been just terrific to be part of such an interesting panel with so many really impressive women. Thank you very much to everyone who's presented. I certainly learned a lot tonight, and it's been really galvanising. And I think given us that energy that we do need to take forward that agenda for women. Women matter for business, and very obviously business matters for women as well. And we decided this year in the Labour Party that we were going to make our main thrust of policy development, communications, everything else for International Women's Day to be around that role of women in the economy, because we think that women hold the key to a stronger economy. And that's a key that is not being turned as much as it should be now because of the variety of factors people have been talking about. But Labour ultimately wants to deal with those barriers, remove them, and make sure that we do have that strong economy with women at the very forefront. So first of all, of course, we have to focus quite rightly on what Rachel was pointing out. If you look at those governing bodies for different businesses, those executive teams, we know what the evidence shows. And we know that more diverse businesses tend to be far more successful businesses. They're more sustainable. Companies with the most gender diverse executive teams are 25% more likely to be above average when it comes to their profitability than those with the least diverse teams. Companies where more than 3 in 10 executives are women are more likely to outperform companies with fewer women. I mean, this is all pretty obvious stuff, but we've known it for many years and we haven't seen the shift forward that we need to see. The UK is now second in international rankings when it comes to women's representation on boards, but we're still light years away, let's be honest, about where we need to be. There's a huge amount we've got to do. And particularly because of the factors that the sisters have been talking about tonight. We see, for example, when it comes to those directorships, some interesting research from the Fawcett Society, just 8 CEOs on FTSE, within FTSE 100 companies are women. They only hold 13.7% of directorships. And frankly, if the UK is heading towards the top of the pack there, then we really are not in very good company either. Number of people have mentioned the issues about accessing finance being such a huge barrier for women. And the Investing in Women Code, which the Treasury produces, we would say it doesn't produce enough information actually about women and the economy at all, but it does produce the Investing in Women Code. And it shows that in bank financing, just as was mentioned by Liz, far fewer women are applying for bank financing in the first place. Just 15% of applications coming for women. And then actually when they get the chance to, for example, open new business accounts, only about a third of them are being opened by women rather than by men. And while actually overall, if you look at the same kind of loan product, you see that women are sometimes able to access that funding, but generally at a far lower level, less money coming to them because they're not being backed by banks to the same amount. So on average, the average loan amount approved for female-led businesses is about £25,000. For male-led businesses, £33,000. So clearly a big difference there. And Liz has pointed to the difference in venture capital, particularly marked there. And I would say it's especially clear when it comes to Black, Asian and minority ethnic women, where the levels are really catastrophically low. We really need to take urgent action here. Labour suggested a number of changes that we need to make. And you may have seen our commitment to growing 100,000 new companies, making sure that we do that in the first term of a Labour government. We've been clear, those new companies must in many cases be driven by women. We need to create that dynamism from women-led businesses. We've got to tackle also the motherhood penalty. We launched the Equal Recovery Pledge that many people will have seen, because inequalities that already existed were supercharged through the pandemic. So we've got to take urgent action. That means, for example, giving workers the right to flexible working, helping parents manage work alongside childcare, making it illegal to make a new mother redundant from notification of pregnancy until 6 months after their return to work. We've been promised measures on all of this, particularly around maternity redundancy protections by government. We've had literally nothing to take that forward. Labour would deliver on it. And there's more within what I like to call our New Deal for working women. It was presented to our last conference as a New Deal for working people, but it would have the biggest impact on women because it would be, for example, ensuring that actually those women could have equal pay comparisons across employers, not just within one company, but across employers, and that they could have the same kind of flexibility in their hands as their employers so often have in their possession, making that a much more equal balance than where it is at the moment. And of course, also tackling so-called third-party harassment, where we've got a ridiculous situation that you can have women harassed time and time again at work, and the employer can avoid responsibility for that if they say, well, it wasn't actually me doing that sexual harassment, it was one of the people using the service that we provide, and they do nothing about it. Labour would change that. Of course, there's much more that needs to change. We need childcare that actually works, as Bridget Phillipson has said time and again, and set out in the Children's Recovery Plan how we would encourage and ensure that investment that's necessary. We need to make sure that we have a focus on those aspects of work that are so difficult for so many women. Naomi talked about women's safety in terms of getting to and from work. I know that the Unite Trade Union is working on this too with their campaign around getting us home safely. It's something I've been working on with Lou Haig as well. What can we do so that women aren't putting themselves at risk appallingly just simply because they happen to be working in the evenings, working nights and so forth, as so many women have to do. And of course, we've got to tackle those structural barriers as well. That's why we've said we'll have a new Race Equality Act as Labour, why we would introduce ethnicity pay gap reporting now, why we wouldn't be dilly-dallying and faffing about as the government has been, apparently finding every excuse not to move forward rather than grasping the nettle. And it's why we would equality impact assess all of our policies. If you look at some of those COVID era policies in particular, they very obviously did not support women in the way that was needed. We would argue that was particularly the case for a lot of the support for the self-employed, because actually you saw so many women falling through the gaps, because it tends to be us women who have those mixtures, for example, of on payroll work and self-employment. Tends to be women who aren't sitting within that formulaic picture of the self-employed person. We raised that time and again. We also raised the inequalities in access to financing through COVID support. We would make sure that would never happen under a Labour government, because we would design in equality impact assessment from the beginning. And we are taking a similar approach when it comes to policy development as well, with our National Policy Forum and Stronger Together, the policy review that I'm leading. Every team, every commission within that process, I've said to them very clearly, they have to consider equalities from the beginning. They need to be considering the impact of every policy area for women and what we can do to remove those barriers and enable women to fulfill their potential. I think there's a lot we can do. There's so much room for improvement, and there's so much that we have to do. And I do think the power is in our hands. I mean, Liz is absolutely right. It does take a very long time, some of this, but when we've been in government before, we have achieved for women. When we're in local government, we achieve for women. In Wales, we've been achieving for women. And I'll just finish by reflecting on the title of this session, that business is for girls. I think big businesses for girls, small businesses, micro businesses, medium-sized businesses are for girls, just like I think technology is for girls, just like I think physics and hard maths are for girls as well. And we've got to be the voice of those girls and the campaigners for their futures. And after tonight's discussion, I'm really excited about what we can do together. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anneliese. I love that. Really, really brilliant canter through everything that we do. Wow, wouldn't it make a difference to have Labour in government? We know that. So I wanted to ask first if there are any questions from the floor, if anyone would like to ask a question. And if not, I've got some that I've noted down. But would anyone like to put their hand up? Yeah, Margaret, I think you were first.
Yeah, hi. It's an observation. I mean, there's so much to say about just about everything that's been said this evening, which I think is really important. One of the things that Naomi mentioned earlier, which I think is very interesting, is about the imposter syndrome and how women suffer from this and it holds them back. What I found interesting is when you talk about it when there are men there, they all go, oh yes, we all feel the same way, which I think is quite interesting, because it's not that they experience that differently, it's that they respond to it differently, and that men will overcome it and still present as confident, but women don't. So I think that's a kind of quite interesting nuanced wrinkle on the approach to that whole sense of what holds women back. That was just an early thought I had. But I also think, coming in later on what Anneliese said, one thing I think is really important, gender equality reporting in terms of pay, there are loopholes around that. So say, for example, law firms can have a partnership structure that then manages the business through a company that then is not, that manages to kind of hide the gender pay discrepancies between the partnership and the other elements. So that's completely unrelated, but that's something else I think that government would do well to look at, because there's a lot of hidden, you know, the pay discrimination that can kind of slip through the reporting requirements that are being put in place, and that I really think need to be addressing.
Thank you. Good question, Margaret. I'm going to ask Davina to speak next and ask her question. We'll take all three questions, all three hands up at the same time, so we get through them all. So Davina.
Hi, Davina. Yes, thanks. So I guess my question is probably more for Rachel, but it's really talking about the ESG agenda, which is so hot with businesses right now, and whether she felt that that was having an impact on the diversity of boards, because now I guess firms and organisations are kind of keen to show their ESG credentials. I know I'm being asked to join a lot more boards than I probably was before. So I was wondering whether she's seen any change in that, and also generally what the panel thought about kind of quotas for boards of larger organisations, whether they are not-for-profits or commercial organisations.
So glad you asked that question, the second one especially, Davina, because that's one I wanted to ask myself. I'm a strong believer in quotas and positive measures, but I'd love to know what the panel think. So then just we'll round up all three questions shortly. Jackie, would you like to unmute and ask your question, and then I'll put them to the panel.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here on this platform with all of you this evening. Bit of a statement and then a question. Okay. I'm absolutely appalled at the fact that we have so many businesses that are dominated predominantly by white men. It's really scary. And Anneliese has spoken about risk and risk assessments and equality, impact assessments, etc. If we look around the world, besides business, we're in a frightening state at this moment in time with how men are dominating the world and how we have all these wars that are going on. So my question is this: as much as I'm frightened of all of these men, we actually need to get them in the room. We need to educate them. And the question is how we can do that. Thank you.
Wow, you've all put really brilliant questions to our panel. So just a reminder, one about the gender pay gap and how we can kind of re-look at that so companies can't hide. One about the ESG agenda. I'm assuming that's equality something, Davina. Sorry, I should have asked. ESG.
Mental, social.
It's environmental, social and governance agenda.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm aware of CSR, but for some reason I haven't heard of that one. And then how do we believe in quotas, and how do we educate both men and I would say women at school to be entrepreneurial and to think of business as a career and not to be held back? So I'm going to start with Naomi. Would you like to canter through that?
Yes, so just to say that I'm totally in favour of quotas. I think we have to have them in the music industry. We've got something called the Key Change Initiative, which is about 50-50 gender representation on festival lineups and at events and on panels and that sort of thing. And I think it's important to force the change, and then hopefully it becomes the norm, and then you don't need the quotas anymore. Just to come back on the comment about imposter syndrome, I think absolutely if men have it, they hide it well. But also I think it's not just how you deal with imposter syndrome, it's the way that if you make a mistake as a woman, sometimes it feels like men will crowd in and say, oh, look, she's not up to the job. And actually you have to keep to a much higher standard, whereas men seem to be able to make multiple mistakes, and it's they just sort of somehow front it out and it's fine and it's not questioned. So I do think that women are held to higher standards because they're more vulnerable and they're more of a rarity, unfortunately. I don't know how we resolve that one, but I do think it's important to get men into these discussions, and I've had a lot of support from male colleagues in the musicians union. Otherwise I would never have been elected in an organisation that's kind of 68% male. But there are still challenges, and there are going to be challenges around if I push the equality agenda too much, might I lose some of that support? Because I think it's, I've certainly not recently, but sat on committees and boards where you hear the sort of, oh, well, if we have too many women on the committee, they're going to want to talk about women's issues, which I know, so frustrating. And I hope that that's not the way that most male colleagues feel. You've really got to prove yourself if you're in a senior role or on a board, and it takes time. But yes, all for male allies and finding ways to get them involved in the discussion.
Great. Rachel, do you want to answer directly the ESG question then?
There's actually several questions going. several answers to several questions going to my head. ESG agenda. I'm probably a little bit biased on this because the company that I work for is into responsible investment. So, and that's kind of their thing. And, you know, it's kind of trending and all the rest of it. I think that, you know, as always with capitalism, demand drives supply, and our company clearly thinks there's money to be made out of responsible investment because there's a market for it. I think I'm a little bit skeptical because when it's driven by shareholders, not all shareholders are individuals. There's pension funds, there's massive investors whose, you know, primary aim is to maximize shareholder profit, and that's the only thing they're interested in. And they're the big guys, they're the big guns that really drive the agenda of business because they've got the most votes at the shareholder meeting. It's a numbers game. I do want to touch on some of the other issues. In terms of quotas on boards, again, the trouble is that there's a reluctance from government to do anything to penalise business, which, as I said earlier, you can have a regime, you can have the UK Corporate Governance Code, you can say that boards should consider X, Y and Z diversity characteristics in appointing to boards, and say that if you don't do that, you need to explain in your annual report why you haven't done it. But actually there's no teeth to that. Like, nobody, you know, the police don't, if you have 100% your board, the police aren't going to turn up to your company and say you're breaking the law, you're breaking the UK Corporate Governance Code, because it's a comply and explain, it's a gentleman's agreement. There is no enforcement there. And without enforcement, I'm not sure how it happens. The other issue is, of course, the supply. And it's probably easier actually to get women non-executive directors onto boards from outside than it is to train up junior managers to be middle managers, to be senior managers, to be promoted to executive directors, because that's a longer process. And so, you know, the supply chain issues of women coming through organisations and not dropping off is an issue.
Yeah, good, really good point. And I think mentoring programs like the FWN one obviously can really help. But it need, you know, we're very much more political and public, aren't we? We perhaps need to think more about business mentoring. Anneliese, would you like to address some of those questions, and then I'll come to Liz?
Yeah, sure. I think they're incredibly important questions, actually. And Margaret's points about imposter syndrome are really important. I had a very interesting meeting recently with a couple of really interesting businesswomen. One runs a company, I think it's called Not Only Pink and Blue, and they do a lot of kind of educational work around children's aspirations, the education system and parents and this kind of thing, and you know, businesses becoming parent friendly, that kind of stuff. Then another one that produces unisex clothes for kids called Ducky Zebra, that completely, you know, for once you can't tell the difference because they're all just the same, because actually, as we know, children can have the same interests. It is possible for boys and girls to have the same interests. That is a feasible thing. But we were talking about exactly those kinds of issues, you know, why quite early, very often with girls, and then of course developing into women, there will be that difference in confidence that, you know, I think many men often might, yes, feel a bit of that imposter syndrome, but they still have that reserve of confidence that they can kind of just get on with it. Whereas for women, you know, often without that support that they might need as well, potentially, and without other role models being there, and possibly with other challenges, you know, they're not able then to get beyond that syndrome. So I do think it's really important to look at this, but I think in doing so, yes, we need to look at the girls and women, but I think we need to, just as you said, Margaret, we need to look at the boys and men as well, and what they're doing, and whether they're, you know, getting rid of those barriers too. I think the point about partnership arrangements are really important. I would say also, when we're looking at these inequalities, really important to look at self-employment as well. I mean, Liz kind of mentioned this too, but if we look at some of the changes that have taken place recently, you know, quite a lot of women dropping out of self-employment, particularly self-employment that was decently remunerated. So we need to understand what was going on there. Davina, I think it's a really good question. And I think sometimes, and Rachel talked really persuasively about this, sometimes you need to have hard edges. Persuasion can be important, good examples can be important. I think there has been quite a lot of change around women on boards, for example. As was mentioned, it's been a kind of aspirational target, it's not been a hard one. But we know from our own party that actually it wasn't until we had all women shortlists that we've really started to see that change being driven forward. So I understand the government's new voluntary target is 40% by 2025. I think that's very positive. We have seen quite rapid change, but we do need to see, of course, further change as well. And then Jackie, about getting men in the room, I think that's really important. I would say, and I've worked with a lot of male feminists, which is fantastic, really, really strong voices for women. Ed Miliband, actually, I think was an interesting, when he was back being a policy advisor, he was a really strong feminist working with Harriet and others when we were in government. But I think also we always need to be saying, look, this is important for our whole economy. When you don't have women in those positions of power within our economy, in those decision-making situations, you don't have the economy growing as strongly and sustainably as it needs to be. So it's in everybody's interest. I think we can then get the men in the room sometimes as well to be part of that argument too.
Oh, thank you, Anneliese, for answering those questions. Liz, what would you like to cover out of those answers, those questions, I should say?
Lots of points to pick up there. First of all, let's start with the gender pay gap. I think that we are in danger of getting ourselves into a kind of cul-de-sac with thinking about the gender pay gap. So I'm all for the hard maths. My PhD before I started running pubs was in history and philosophy of maths. So up with the hard maths. So if we look at gender pay gap and measuring the gender pay gap as a problem within statistics, from a statistical point of view, if you want to measure something like that, well, it's easiest to do where you can remove a lot of the factors which will change what somebody's paid. So actually, it's easier to go to an organisation and say, report to me on your gender pay gap, because then you're looking at people working within the same sectors. So from a statistical point of view, understanding the gender pay gap makes sense to measure it in that way. If we are interested, though, in fixing that and in real gender equality and real equal pay for all sorts of working women, then it, I think, is a mistake to just fixate on that number and the statistical factors which go to make up that number. So, for example, gender pay gap in self-employment is something that isn't measured, and I'm sure Naomi will agree with me, it's an extremely hard thing to measure because we don't have that sort of PAYE reporting. So it becomes a problem of statistics where the only report that I've really seen to try and get into pay gaps within self-employment estimate that at about 40%. It's a much bigger problem within self-employment. And then on top of that, we've got real gender issues within self-employment where, men who are self-employed are mostly in construction, and we kind of understand that and that sort of work. Whereas women who are self-employed are far more likely to be doing it around caring responsibilities. They'll be dismissed as mumpreneurs, which is a horrible, misogynistic, genderized term that we need to just do away with. And they're going to be working in part-time roles, in caring roles, in that sort of sectors. And quite frankly, we don't understand it. And this is where I go back to, again, it's not good enough. The reporting that we've got, the understanding that we've got covers one section of working women. And yet there are millions of working women who we just don't understand. And until we as women organisations go, great, we're seeing work being done on gender pay gaps in large organisations. They've had a few years to put HR processes in place, and we are seeing that being reduced. Right now, we need to start expanding on what we're doing to talk about other groups of women. So that's gender pay gap. Back to what we're talking about with confidence and sort of imposter syndrome. I went to a really interesting research paper on this at King's Business School a couple of weeks ago, and what we were looking at there was the way in which women get feedback. And we are really bad at this, because when we talk about women in business situations, we just tend to say, well, you're not confident, work on your confidence. Well, how do you want me to do that? Where is there in that feedback something that a woman can take away and say, right, okay, this is how I need to perform in meetings in order to demonstrate my confidence? We don't do that for women. And interestingly, the feedback that women were getting that, oh, you need to work on your confidence, sometimes was going to women that were saying, well, I'm really confident. That's not my experience of myself. So I do think that when we're talking about imposter syndrome and we're talking about confidence, actually we do ourselves down. I know lots of confident women who are still facing those sorts of barriers and are still facing sexism at work. That stop explaining away some of the problems that we've got by blaming the women. We're back to that mantra, let's not fix the women, let's fix the sexist situations that they find themselves in. So my final point, absolutely. Yes, quotas. That's helped in politics. Why not quotas? Let's take the power back. And I don't just want equal pay, I want equal ownership, I want equal wealth. Let's start working on those as well.
What a brilliant manifesto, Liz. That's brilliant to go in Anneliese's kind of policy documents going forward. I think it's been a really fantastic discussion. I think we've come away definitely with thinking. Well, one thing I'd like to say is it feels like we need more networks in business for women in business. It doesn't, from what I'm hearing, and certainly from when I worked in business at the start of my career, there didn't feel like there were kind of safe networking spaces for me where I could learn off other women. So that's one thing. But the second thing, I'm so glad to hear everyone endorsing quotas and targets, because here in Wales we're doing something incredible, which with my work hat on at Women's Equality Network Wales we've been lobbying for a long time, which is quotas, legally binding gender quotas for the Senedd, and that is going to be put into law. And I think what that means is back to your point, Rachel, is there will be teeth, because it's a legal necessity that political parties put forward an equal number of candidates and that the Senedd ends up being gender balanced. And that will be because the Labour Party have done the most work on this, followed by Plaid Cymru. The Conservatives are really bad. But those two parties, if they're not always the two largest parties, what's going to happen to gender balance? It will go back to the dark ages. So we absolutely, I think it would be great if we could push for in our manifesto, Anneliese, a 50-50 target for women on boards of the FTSE 100 or the FTSE 350. I think that would be something really, really positive that the Labour Party could do. So I am going to wrap up now because we're nearing the end of our time, but it's been a brilliant evening. Please join Labour Business. Liz has put the link in the chat. Really important you join that. And because the more women, in fact, on Labour Business, the better as well, the better results we'll get. So it looks like Liz and Rachel probably need some support as well on that forum. So yeah, it's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much to all our speakers. And thank you to the Fabian Women for organising this brilliant event. Liz and Rachel, well done. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for coming, everyone in the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.